Great. So welcome everybody to today's session. We're so glad you joined us today to learn more about competency-based education. And again, if you're just arriving, we welcome you to introduce yourselves in the chat box. And please use it freely throughout today's session to ask questions and offer comments or resources. And feel free to answer each other's questions. We know there's lots of people in the room who know a lot about what we're discussing today. I'm Eliot Levine, and I'm the research director at the Aurora Institute, and I lead the Competency Works initiative. And my co-presenters today are Althea Brutus-Garraway, who's an ESL and ELA teacher at Flushing International High School in New York City, Alexis Chambers, who's a policy associate at the Aurora Institute, Travis Lape, who's the Innovative Programs Director for the Harrisburg School District in South Dakota, and Rosemary Milcheski, who's the Assistant Principal at Flushing International High School. And we're greatly looking forward to hearing from Althea, Rosemary, and Travis about their experiences with implementing competency-based education in their schools and districts. Today's session will give you a broad overview of competency-based education, which some districts also call mastery-based or proficiency-based education. And we'll talk about why we need to change our current system, the great advances that have already happened across the country, and strategies we can use to transform our schools and the education system as a whole. We're also going to be sharing resources you can use to go deeper in your own schools. And we want you to realize that there is a system of schools and organizations and policies that can support your efforts based on lessons learned from schools that have been doing this work for many years. So what is competency-based education? I'll start by reviewing the Aurora Institute's 7-part definition, which was developed in collaboration with more than 100 experts in the field. And you can also consult the report that's shown here, and there will be a link to it in the chat box. It's important to say that there's not a single prescribed way to do competency-based education, but there are some common features you'll see across settings. And we'll also talk about how competency-based education differs from the traditional model, which wasn't designed to prepare all students with the full set of skills they would need for their futures. The first element of the definition that you can see here focuses on student agency, because learning sciences research and the experience of many educators tell us that students learn more when they are able to make important decisions about their own learning experiences, and when they have the opportunity to create and apply knowledge, rather than just being passive recipients. This approach also promotes a growth mindset, and it helps students build intrinsic motivation, which leads to deeper engagement. The second point, assessment can't only be about grading students. It needs to be meaningful and positive and empowering, and it needs to provide information that can guide their next steps and teachers' next steps. In competency-based education, assessments are embedded in a personalized learning cycle in which students have multiple opportunities to demonstrate mastery, which means that they don't necessarily all take the same assessments at the same time and in the same order. And summative assessments, traditional tests and so on, are used, but they're balanced with formative assessment and clear communication about how a student is progressing and what supports they need to move forward. Many of the assessments are also performance-based, where students are showing they can apply what they've learned. And some assessments are even designed by students. One clear sign that assessment reform is needed is the huge number of students who get high grades in high school, but then need to do remedial work in college. And in many cases, this is because their grades in academic subjects have been inflated due to their good behavior, classroom participation, and so on. In competency-based schools, students receive timely, differentiated, I think I skipped ahead one slide. Here we go. I think I may have been ahead on the last one, if so, I apologize. In competency-based schools, students receive timely, differentiated supports based on their individual learning needs, which means providing learning opportunities that are targeted to students' current level of competency. And it also means recognizing when there are gaps and addressing the gaps quickly so students are making strong progress and don't get disengaged and demoralized. Competency-based districts and schools also make a commitment to make sure that every student is succeeding and to continue innovating until every student is succeeding. Students also progress based on demonstrating their mastery, not based on how much time they've spent in a classroom. And they learn actively using different pathways and varied pacing, so there's not only one way to get to their destination. And you may often hear the term time-based or seat time-based. When we say that, we mean that students often advance to the next grade or course after a predetermined amount of time, like a semester or a school year, even if they haven't mastered the material. And you also, in the traditional system, have the opposite situation where many students are required to continue in a course even after they've already mastered the material. So in a competency-based system, learners advance when they demonstrate mastery, not after a predetermined amount of time. The Quality Principles book shown here is another essential resource if you're trying to go deeper on all of the ideas we're talking about today, and we'll put a link to that in the chat box also. The next element of the definition of competency-based education is about equity, and we believe that creating a competency-based education system is an essential part of eliminating the deep inequities in our education system. That's why the definition states clearly that strategies to ensure equity for all students are embedded in the culture, structure, and pedagogy of competency-based systems. And we think of this, as you were hearing David and others talk about in the previous session, if you were there, or the first session this morning. This means interrupting inequitable practices, examining biases, and creating inclusive multicultural environments for students and adults. That's actually the Great Schools Partnership definition that David mentioned this morning. And the report shown here, Designing for Equity, goes into much greater depth on this topic and how we implement it in competency-based schools. There's a lot packed into the seventh and final element, so let me unpack it a little. Having rigorous common expectations is also an equity strategy, so different students are not held to different standards, which we know is the case often across different schools and zip codes and classrooms. The part here about knowledge, skills, and dispositions points to the focus in competency-based education on a broader set of outcomes that prepare students for college and career and lifelong learning. And they include things like deeper learning of academic knowledge, but also skills and dispositions that students need in order to apply that knowledge in new contexts and to manage their own learning, such as through self-direction, collaboration, social emotional skills, and so on. And the last part, the standards need to be explicit and transparent so students know what they're supposed to be learning and how to improve, which is often not the case in traditional education. And that transparency helps students take ownership of their learning, and it helps adults know what's working and what support students need. I just also want to mention a couple things that competency-based education isn't, to address a couple of common misconceptions. It's not simply working through an online curriculum with students progressing at their own pace. And it's not just moving quickly through a checklist of activities at shallow levels. It's really about demonstrating deeper learning and the ability to apply what you've learned. So I've used the word personalized. Just skipped a slide by accident, I'll go back. So there are a variety of reasons that schools are turning to competency-based education. I've already discussed some of these reasons, but I'll add that many schools and communities are noticing that globally, some of the highest performing countries are moving in these directions, And also, I saw people mention their interest in the pandemic in the chat box, and I'll note that during the COVID-19 pandemic, they're finding that competency-based education helps with hybrid and remote learning, which comes from many factors, but two in particular are teachers having a better understanding of where students are in their learning progressions, and also students having stronger agency and self-direction and transparency about what they're supposed to be learning. So I've used the word personalized a few times, and what makes learning personalized? Our definition is that it's tailoring learning for each student's strengths, needs, and interests, including enabling student voice and choice in what, how, when, and where they learn to provide flexibility and supports to ensure mastery of the highest standards possible. You'll see other definitions. They often contain these elements. Again, some people use personalized learning to refer mostly to progressing through a lot of curriculum online and exclusively online at their own pace. That's not what we're talking about here today. I want to take a quick look at how competency-based education is advancing across the United States. Back in 2012, there were about a dozen states with pilots and just a few states with advanced policies that enabled competency-based education or credit flexibility policies. Did I go too far before? This was the first map I was supposed to be showing. I'm not sure if I went to that one, next one too soon. But you can see in 2019 that that number has doubled, and 49 states have enacted policies that enable some aspects of competency-based education, such as seat time waivers. And so clearly interest and implementation are growing. Okay, so now we're going to turn to Alexis Chambers from the Aurora Institute, and she will talk about policies that are needed to catalyze and advance competency-based education. Thanks, Alexis.
Thank you, Eliot. And as Eliot mentioned, I'm Alexis Chambers, and I'm a policy associate here at the Aurora Institute. And I'm very excited to be here with all of you today. As you can see, CBE is growing across the nation, and many states are implementing innovative practices to ensure that all students are achieving higher levels of mastery and experiencing deeper learning. So there are many ways for states to get started in this work, and we'll explore some state examples of shifts in policy to catalyze competency-based education. Next slide, please. There are many entry points for policy leaders wishing to enable the shift to a more personalized competency-based system. States that do not yet have many enabling policies in place may wish to take one or two incremental initial steps to create space for new learning models, while a state that already has made some progress may be contemplating some bolder, more comprehensive steps towards transformation. This graphic summarizes the different entry points that policy leaders could discuss to catalyze the transformation to K-12 education in their state. Next slide, please. So next we'll start digging into some states that are getting started and some of the policy shifts that we're seeing in these states. Next slide. So many states are building capacity for competency-based education through work groups and task forces. In 2019, Washington passed legislation that convened a cross-sector group tasked with exploring ways to increase student access to CBE pathways aligned to both career and post-secondary goals. This group also provided recommendations to the State Board of Education and the legislature on ways to increase capacity for competency-based education in their state. States find this beneficial not only because it creates buy-in across a variety of stakeholders, but it also helps folks to really rally around a common vision for student learning. And it helps to identify gaps in policies that need be addressed so that innovative new practices can flourish. Next slide, please. A profile of a graduate or a portrait of a graduate serves as a common vision to modernize and redefine more holistic graduation requirements based on what students need to know and be able to do upon graduation. The profile of a graduate answers the questions of what does it mean for a student to be prepared for future success, And what knowledge, skills, and dispositions do students in our community need to be successful as they enter post-secondary or the workforce? Utah embarked on this journey through a task force and a pilot, and in 2019 launched a model of the profile of a graduate or portrait of a graduate, and they're calling it the talent map. And this serves as a vision and articulation of the knowledge and skills that Utah students need to be college and career ready. Next slide, please. Many states consider innovation zones as their entry point into competency-based education systems. Innovation zones or districts of innovation help state policy leaders identify outdated policies and regulations or barriers that may get in the way of educators designing new innovative learning models. They create space for districts and schools to innovate, identify policy barriers, and then remove those barriers through either waivers or legislation. In Arkansas, school districts can petition the State Board of Education for all or some of the same waivers granted to open enrollment public charter schools. Schools then apply for these waivers, and once accepted, the state continues to provide technical assistance throughout the life of the waiver as schools implement these new innovative practices. Next slide, please. As states lay the groundwork for innovation to flourish, many states begin to tackle systems like assessments to support the shift to CBE. Next slide, please. Assessment is essential for students or for understanding what students have learned and can provide timely feedback to educators on where students are in their learning and also inform what sort of supports they need in order to succeed. New Hampshire was granted flexibility through the Innovative Assessment Demonstration Authority, the IADA, for its use of PACE, the Performance Assessment of Competency Education Program. PACE is an innovative assessment and accountability system grounded in competency-based approaches designed to ensure that students have meaningful opportunities to achieve deeper learning. In redefining systems of assessment, state leaders and practitioners consider what is needed to make assessments more meaningful and integrally linked to student learning. Next slide, please. As states get farther along in their journey to a competency-based system, alignment across K-12, higher education, career and technical education, and the workforce is essential to support the long-term shift in this vision of student learning. Next slide. So aligning competency-based pathways across K-12, higher education, CTE, and the workforce is a critical policy to support a modernized education system that leads to equitable opportunities and high-demand future jobs. State leaders in Alabama are developing in-demand career pathways through their continuous learning system that aligns workforce development programs around the attainment of valuable credentials, post-secondary graduation credit, and work-based learning experiences. State policymakers can become partners with practitioners in identifying and removing systemic barriers to launching and supporting a shift to more personalized learning models. We've published many resources to help further explore all of these entry points, like our 2020 state policy priorities and our current to future state report. I saw someone also mention, how can we leverage COVID in this current time to transform education and redesign for the future? And we also released another publication on that. And all of these links will be in the chat box. And I highly recommend these as starting points for states that are looking to create more space for innovation, and also states that have began to create some space and are looking for guidance on what innovations are happening nationwide. Thank you, and I'll pass the mic back to Eliot.
Great, thanks so much, Alexis. It's great to hear about all the progress that's happening in policy initiatives around the country and those examples. And one state that's doing deeply innovative work is South Dakota. Just before I introduce Travis, I just wanted to say that I do see these questions in the chat box, and we're actually running a couple of minutes ahead of schedule, so we're going to have plenty of time for questions, and we'll certainly get to them, and please keep them coming. Really interested in having the conversations from Mike, Todd, and Rebecca Lambert's recent questions. So getting back to South Dakota, I'm very pleased to welcome Travis Lape. the Innovative Programs Director from Harrisburg, South Dakota. I spent a day there last year with Travis and in one of the elementary schools, and it was just incredible what they're accomplishing. So glad, Travis, that you're here to talk with us, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Travis, we cannot hear you. Eliot, we cannot hear you either. You muted. Okay.
Travis, are you still there? You disappeared from my screen. I wonder if you lost your signal. I think what I'm going to do is keep an eye out for Travis to come back. And in the meantime, Althea and, oh, he's going to re-enter now. I see named Eliot Levine. He's going to be a second Eliot Levine. I don't know what happened, but here he comes.
Right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Awesome.
And
all right.
Travis, are you able to right click on your name just to change it from Eliot Levine to Travis Late?
There you go.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. Sorry about that. I must have lost connection with my audio. But so honored to be here, Eliot, and be on this panel to share the amazing work that our staff is partaked in and is deeply rooted in on this idea of competency-based, standard-based, and we've got a mix of personalized and customized learning happening in our district. For us, our district has been in this work for over 10 years at the high school level. That's where this work started. And then we found out very quickly that we needed to get this work down to our middle school and elementary environment. Next slide will show a little bit of our growth in our district. And so you'll see just how much we've grown since 2000 to 2020-21 school year right now. We are the fastest growing school district in our state. We grow by about anywhere from 300 to 350 kids every year. And that has allowed us some flexibility with innovation, because with growth allows more opportunities, and with growth allows for some flexibility with some different things. And so today I'm going to give you a high level view of our elementary structure and really kind of how we approach that. Next slide, Eliot. We approach this by really looking at what Dr. Tony Wagner says are the 7 skills that our children will need to survive in this changing world. And when we look at these, we've got to ask ourselves, are our schools truly doing this? Are we really being innovative and making sure that these 7 skills are truly embedded into what we do every day with our kids, from our language, from our classes that we teach, from the connections that we make with our community and our industry partners in our community? Are we really doing this? And so this is something that we come back to all the time, asking ourselves, when they graduate from Harrisburg High School, will they be able to look at these 7 changing skills? Will they be able to take a hold of these? And so we started asking kind of some what if questions. Next slide. We started asking, like, what if we thought about assessment differently? How could we think about assessment differently? Rather than having it be paper pencil assessment or fill in the blank or multiple choice, what does this look like? And so we asked that question, what if? What if we did this? What if we had our learners produce artifacts of knowledge and created a portfolio for our kids rather than one assessment at the end of a unit? What if we change that? And what lends itself to that? Next slide. We asked the question, what if we changed up our learning spaces? Rather than having classrooms, we call them learning studios. And the reason for the learning studio is this idea of real world. In the real world, we have art studios and we have music studios. Learners, the artist goes into the studio, all the tools are there for the artist to be successful. They have to put forth their effort. They have to put forth their talent, but the soundboard is there. The headphones are there. The microphones are there. The tools are there. Same thing with our classrooms. The tools are there inside our classrooms to be successful, but the learner has to take ownership. The learner has to drive that learning. And so we have learning lounges in our in our learning studios. We have creation areas where they can create and think flexibly. We have coaching corners where direct instruction can happen. We have the community zone where we have large groups gathering. So again, it's back to thinking about our spaces and asking, what if we did this differently? What if we made a learning studio and called it a learning studio and created a language around that? Next slide. Then we dive into kind of looking at, like, what if we looked at our curriculum differently? You know, I think Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory meme here is fitting. You know, please tell me how this year's expensive curriculum is so much better than next year's. And we've been there. If you've been in education, and some of you probably are looking, I'm young in education in this profession. Some of you probably have more years of experience, but you've been there. You've been through an adoption of a new curriculum, and this curriculum is going to be the thing. This is what's going to get us the results. This is going to fill the gaps that we're missing. And when we get into the actual work of it, we realize very quickly that our learners are different. Our learners have changed from the time we looked at the curriculum to now when we're using it. And so the curriculum is a tool. It can't be what really drives what we do. And so we have to ask ourselves, what if we thought differently about curriculum? What if we looked at this different? Next slide. So in Harrisburg, in our personalization of elementary schools, we asked the simple question, what makes a second grader a third grader? And when we ask that question to teachers and to parents, we get kind of this blank stare of like, what do you mean? And I honestly ask them, I say, I don't know what makes your child become a third grader after 180 days in school. Because you know your child maybe is still struggling with foundational understandings of reading and being able to read. But they're very high in math. They're very capable in doing above grade level math. So why do we put them in these boxes? So for us, we've really looked at these 4 circles: flexible tools and spaces, data-driven instruction, learner agency, and target instruction. Those are our 4 boxes, or our 4 groups that we try to fill every time we start to think about, okay, what shifts do we need to make in our environments? But this idea in our elementaries is we asked the what if question and we were able to move on it. In our elementary schools, we have no grade level focus. So we have what we call cohorts of learners, 2nd through 5th grade, roughly 94 to 98 of them. And that keeps us inside our district policy of class size. And we have then a grade level teacher. So we have a 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade teacher, 4 teachers, but they no longer teach those grade levels. They teach learners. And we have learning continuums, we have modules, we have the ability to move learners based on where they're at and what they need. And it really has started to grow this idea of, we don't need grade levels to educate children. We need flexibility, and we need the ability to empower our staff and our learners to drive their instruction. Next slide. So when we look at this, we looked at it through the lens of this tool. Too often, and you've been there, we've tried to fix something by purchasing a new tool. Maybe it's a new curriculum, maybe it's new technology, maybe it's a new program. And then we figure out very quickly it doesn't fit our school structure. Our structures don't allow for it. I'm a teacher that teaches whole group every day. And now this new curriculum is telling me to teach small group. That's not going to work. I'm not going to use this. Then it moves down to instructional practices, and we look at Marzano or Hattie, and we find out very quickly that the tool and the structure in which we're working in doesn't even support in research in what best practices are. And then we get down to that belief that all learners can learn, because we got into education because of that, because we believe all learners can learn. So to make a systematic change, to make sustainable change for the future, we have to start at the bottom and ask ourselves, do we truly believe all learners can learn? If we say yes to that, then nothing can stand in our way of making changes for our kids. But if we don't answer that honestly, and we just surface level say yes, then that's when we start to feel like we have gaps, or we treat kids differently based on demographics or where they live or what side of the town they come from. Then we miss the boat. And that is where we're at right now in education, is that we have to believe all learners can learn no matter their background. That moves then into instructional practices. What are the instructional practices we're going to use in this environment to really push forward a shift in education? What structures do we need to change? And then what tools are going to support that? If we walk through the bottom up I promise you, you will make sustainable change happen in your district by starting there. Don't go after a tool, don't go after a structure. Start at the belief that all learners can learn. Once our mindsets are made up there and we're believing that, we're on the same train, that moves into the instructional practices. Next slide. So for us, it starts at the base, and that's where the belief of all learners can learn. And that starts at the habits of mind. These 16 habits by Bina Kadlik and Art Costa are our foundation of what we've done. When we did this work, we went to Maine and we got to see 5 schools in Maine. And everybody in Maine was talking about these habits of mind. And we hadn't even heard of them. I mean, when you look at them, you're like, oh yeah, I talk about these. I talk about persisting or managing impulsivity or listening with understanding. But do we really authentically teach it? Do we get our kids to use that language? And so for us, we spend the first 15 days of school onboarding our learners with this idea of habits of mind, thinking flexibly when things get difficult, applying past knowledge to different situations, questioning and problem solving, remaining open to continuous learning. And it all starts with our language as educators. How are we using this to embed everything we do with our kids? Next slide. Then we move into really looking at the puzzle pieces. So we've got the habits of mind, but what are the rest of the puzzle pieces? The rest of the puzzle pieces can't come into play until we have the foundation. And so then we looked at learning continuums. How do we know when kids are ready to move on? What can we use to move them on? So we had to get learning continuums put in place. Then we created flexible spaces with our staff and really thought about what type of spaces will leverage this type of shift in our culture and in our school. And then the final piece and the most important piece of this work is professional development. This work is not possible unless there is a true investment into staff, and an investment in staff for their time, their commitment to this work, and truly making sure that they feel supported to be able to implement the habits of mind, to really build on the learning continuums and understand where learners are at, and how to empower them to use flexible spaces so that it doesn't become a management issue for them. So the final piece of that puzzle piece for us has been the investment in professional development and making sure our staff are empowered to make those changes. Next slide. So what I would encourage everyone is, here's the learning continuums. We can just go through these, Eliot. So this is what our learning continuum looks like for one of our examples. And then I know I'm approaching my time. So next slide will show you my contact information. Again, I gave you a very high level what this is because Eliot said 10 minutes and I was like, I will give my best shot at 10 minutes. But please shoot me an email. I will set up a time to Zoom with your school or Zoom with your staff or whatever and dive deeper into where and how we got this work started. But it has started at our high school 10 years ago. We now have it at the elementary, the middle, and the high school. So we have a progression that builds over time to what our high school is now doing and really working towards. So thanks, Eliot.
Travis, thanks so much. And what a super generous offer that you just made to everybody, which would be so greatly appreciated. And for those of you who are joining the field of competency-based education or looking into it, there is that tremendous generosity. Harrisburg hosts so many visitors. I know that Flushing International High School, who we're about to turn to also, and their larger group that they're part of, the Mastery Collaborative, host visitors. If you haven't been in schools that operate the way you're hearing from these two schools, you should visit sometime because it's really just amazing and it'll transform the way you understand and believe what's possible. So next, I would like to welcome Althea Brutus-Garraway, an ELA and ESL teacher, and Rosemary Milcheski, an assistant principal, and they're both from Flushing International High School in New York City, and they're also part of the Mastery Collaborative, which is one of the largest groups of schools in the country doing competency-based or mastery-based education. The director of the Mastery Collaborative, Joy Nolan, recommended Althea and Rosemary to me for this session and said they're doing truly groundbreaking and transformational work in their high school. And I should mention that both Travis and Althea and Rosemary are in school buildings. Most of their students are back. I know a lot of parts of the country that isn't the case right now. So yeah, you might want to ask them about that too. But welcome, and I'll turn it over to you, Althea and Rosemary.
Thank you so much, Eliot. And thank you, Travis. What a great presentation. And I'm so curious about actually visiting South Dakota and seeing all the amazing things you have done. As Eliot said, my name is Rosemary. And, we cannot really start sharing about our journey without sharing a little bit about our school, because we are a very small and special school in New York City, which is very dear to Althea and my heart as well. Althea, you want to share a little? You want to start sharing a little bit about who we serve?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Eliot, for the introduction, and Rosemary. So as Rosemary mentioned, we are a small school in New York City. We serve recent immigrants who are English language learners, and they come from about 40 different countries and speak over 20 languages. Right now, our population has about 430 students, and we range from grades 9 to 12. When students start our school, since they're all English language learners, they have to take the NYSESAT exam. And they score widely across the range of entering to transitioning level. And of course, our passion is to ensure that they continue to advance so that when they graduate from our school, that they have acquired over proficiency within the English language and also developed in content areas.
Thank you. And we have a very diverse group of students that also come with very diverse like academic levels, language levels, and experiences as well. And we definitely value our students come from their native language and use their native language as a strength within their classes. We are part of the International Network for Public School, which is a network of various schools that serve the same type of population. We are sister schools, and we ground our work on the same four, well, actually it's 5 of them, but these criteria on heterogeneity and collaboration. So all of the work that we do in our classes and also among ourselves is through collaboration. We celebrate our differences, and our students learn through experiential learning. So all of the work that our students do is project-based, and we have been like this since the first international was developed. Language and content integration is something that is more important for us, just given that our students are learning English. So we don't want one class to be just solely on learning English, but instead that they are learning and developing the English language and using the native language, and that being like generally embedded in the classes as they're learning the content as well. So, one of the things we said that is that every teacher here, regardless of what license they have, is a language teacher in nature. And we also value cultural responsive education. I feel like since the schools have been implemented, all the international schools, the ground and all the work is around this, but given that cultural responsiveness is something that is being more pushed around the different states, and we definitely have way to name some of the work that we're doing with our students. Should we go to the next slide? We want to share a little bit about our journey through mastery, and then on the next slide, we'll also provide some examples. So, just we're here because we have been in this journey, but by no means it means that we have figured it all out, right? Like every year we stop and reflect and make changes, just like teaching. So, our school became a master-based school back in 2012 when we as a school decided that we were going to be adapting master-based grading and using Jump Rope as the platform where our students will be checking in their grades. The reason why that came up at that time, after our school being open for 8 years at that point, was because in so many ways we were very progressive in the work that we did with students around social emotional learning and competencies in advisory, but not necessarily in the curriculum. Teachers were already doing projects, like the structure of the classes was around project-based learning. However, when students were asked to reflect on the learning, or when the students themselves went to ask the teacher about how can we improve, it was always referring to like, oh, you got to complete the homework, you got to study more for the exam, but not giving concrete ideas for the student as to how to improve. Like, what are the skills within my class that I need to work on? At that time, we have at the following year, we had the departments create content outcomes. Outcomes are the competencies. In New York City, we call it, well, in some of the New York City schools, they call it outcomes. And when I say mastery-based, it's the same as competency-based education. So, you know, as you can see in this chart, we went from like creating the outcomes, creating the rubrics, norming with the rubrics. Then we went into developing our school-wide language and work habit outcomes. In addition to now seeing how our school community principles will be able to be embedded in the classes, and how would that affect work habit outcomes. So, you know, you will see on 2018, we had to make more drastic changes to our language outcomes and our grading policy to allow for more transparency, cohesiveness. And the reason is because, you know, back in 2014, we had language outcomes, but that didn't really work because the students were at very different levels. And advancing in different levels. And in some way, we also did not want to, quote unquote, penalize our students for not mastering the language outcomes that we have set within our outcomes. So this just gives you a glimpse of the work that we have done. I think the most adaptive work, I think, came also in 2018, when we had to now stop as a community and reflect, like, where are the gaps? Like, you know, we realized that even though we have school-wide outcomes, and there was a clear vertical alignment of how students will be progressing from year to year, there were still gaps in our processes that were not, in some ways, leaving some subjectivities for each of the teachers. And it will be very difficult for a student to move from class to class because the expectations were, quote unquote, different. And we realized that there were things that we needed to come to consensus in regards on how we were using that platform, Jump Rope, to make sure that, you know, we are promoting transparency and also cohesiveness as a school, which are two of the things that I think were also mentioned during that Travis mentioned about part of the definition of competency-based education. We definitely have a lot of areas that we need to work on, and I can share a little bit more about that towards the end. But on the next slide, I think I can share a little bit some of the resources that we have put in here, which are samples that we have used.
Thank you, Rosemary. So in this section, I will talk a bit about how those elements play out in our school. So first of all, as Rosemary mentioned, the competencies, we refer to them as outcomes. So when you receive this resource, you can click on the links to follow some of the samples that we have. So in our outcomes, of course, we intend for them to support our students moving along a continuum. So the indicators are progressive. What is the basic competency level that a student can achieve and how to move upward. Because we value language and content integration, we are continuously assessing students or supporting students in their development of language skills as they are receiving instruction in their content classes. We focus a lot on qualitative elements and giving students feedback that are personalized, individualized based on where they are, based on where they come from, and the expectations that we have in terms of how they can grow. One of the examples that you will see is how I have approached the rubric this year is to provide an additional column for praise, polish, and question. So based on how a student has performed on a particular task or activity, I can provide individualized feedback in the form of praise. What have they done well? Polish, what are some things that they could improve? And questions that are not necessarily questions about the ideas, but questions to push their thinking on where they can go. We encourage at our school that all teachers are focusing on the language outcomes in every grade, in every class. So students are able to develop over the years. And at the end of last year, we focused a lot on ensuring that the language outcomes were now school-wide. So the language of the language outcomes is the same, so that students are able to recognize the expectations along the way. So they're not seeing different expectations or different expressions of what they need to do. The second sample includes a rubric reflection activity, because we want to encourage our students to develop that agency. Not only are they able to see what the teacher expects of them, but they're able to guide themselves, to monitor themselves in their learning. So for example, they reflect on what is the language, what is the expectation, what are the gaps that they might see in themselves, and they're able to guide their own learning in determining where to go to next. For example, in the reflection activity, they would have annotated the language of the rubric, applied the rubric to examples, to work samples, and explain the rationale for their decisions. Why did they give a particular score to a particular work sample? And in doing so, they're processing it for themselves. Okay, so now I'm able to think, where do I need to go? Where do I need to go? What do I need to do as I'm doing my work? How do I apply the same criteria to my own work so that I am also successful? So in that way, they are, facilitating their own growth. They're becoming agents in their own growth. We also value a lot interdisciplinary projects. Of course, since we are a project-based school, we want to ensure that our projects are authentic and meaningful. One example, at the end of last year when schools were closed, we had students do a project called the COVID-19 project. And in this project, students were able to choose essential questions. They chose their roles and products based on their own interests, based on their own abilities. Teachers facilitated their growth based on the research that they provided, opportunities for language development. So thinking of different technologies that could be used, since we had to switch from being face-to-face within a matter of 3 days or so, to switch to being remote. So we started to use things, applications like Flipgrid, Padlet. Of course, that was a learning curve for us also, but these presented language development opportunities that could be integrated with project-based learning. We also emphasize students using their native language, because we recognize that students are transferring knowledge from their native language or their home countries to our country, to learning a new language and content areas that are sometimes very different and very new to them.
Thank you.
Of course, lastly, restorative practices and community principles, as Rosemary mentioned, these provide a lens to see students as unique individuals. We value socio-emotional learning and development. So all of these play a part in ensuring that we see students as individual and we're helping them to grow in ways and avenues that are authentic to them.
Thank you, Tia. And then once we share this presentation, you will be able to actually look through the links that are hyperlinked in here. One more slide. And so just very quickly, where are we right now? We are in the process of actually, because of COVID, we needed to be able to change the structure of our classes because of the blended and remote. So We are definitely putting a lot more emphasis on the value of interdisciplinary projects, and we are working right now on developing some interdisciplinary rubrics as well, where the humanities and the math and the science are also coming together so that students are able to move from class to class, but still following on the same, working on the same project and knowing exactly how to, what's the criteria that they will be reflecting on. We, as always, will continue language and content integration. And we are also in the process of reassessing the qualitative bands of our rubrics, just because we went from being more quantitative even within our mastery system, like, we went from being quantitative to more qualitative, so we have to reflect on the impact that these decisions that we made about a few years ago have had on our students. Yeah. Eliot, I think we because of time, we can just end it here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. And we will move on to questions right now. But first, I just want to say thank you so much for that presentation. And I know from both Travis and from Rosemary and Althea that we're just, in 10 minutes, we can only get so deep, but there's so much more information on their websites. And there's lots of articles that are written about both of the schools, and I will share that one of those in just a minute. From our Competency Works blog, we've written about both schools. But we have a few minutes to take some questions, and just going back to the chat, and thank you, Alexis and Virgil and others for answering questions while everyone was talking. That was super helpful. And I thought I would go back to Rebecca's question, if I can find it. Wow, a lot of questions. And by the way, I saw that someone asked if we're going to get a link to the slides, and the answer is yes, these will all be made available. Rebecca, feel free to unmute if you want. I'm just trying to find your question here. But it was about the transition from...
Yes, and Travis did reach out to me so that we can follow up in conversation if that's probably going to take a while. So I appreciate that, Travis. And then the other one was just about what work is being done at the university level, so that we could align eventually. And I did get a link from Alexis and some info, so I appreciate that. But I don't know if anybody wants to speak to it more.
Travis, could you say a few words to the group about the transition from grade level structure to not?
Yeah, so for us, it really was just about building that culture. So for us to go from grade level structures to no grade level structures was really just bringing on our community, bringing on our parents, and then really just sharing with them like why do we have grade levels, like really putting it on them to reflect on their own child, and really think about like, my child's really good in reading, like they're reading Harry Potter books and they're second grader. Yeah, and guess what, in second grade, I can only take them so far because they're the only one at that level. And so majority of our classroom time is spent with our intervention learners we're trying to fill gaps, we're trying to catch up. And then our higher learners are usually left off, or on the other side of it, we try to meet them in the middle, but then our bottom learners that still need some support aren't getting all the support they need because they're getting sent to special education, they're getting intervention time, like they're getting shipped out of their classroom so many times that there's a lot of disruption in their day. So the less disruptions we can have in a child and the more confidence we can build in them to amplify their strengths and let them know that they can do their strengths and achieve that, and then support them in their challenges in learning, we can really start to bridge some gaps. And so the ability to have 4 teachers across the disciplines, in elementary, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, and then break it apart and not let them focus on grade level content, but more about focusing on standards and skills. So like, for example, real quick in math, we have our 4 teachers that teach different strands. So one teacher teaches all of fractions. She teaches fractions and how it starts in 3rd grade and how it ends in 5th grade. And so they can focus on that. So it's not about ability grouping kids or moving kids based on that. It's about when I'm in fractions and I'm ready for fractions, I go to this teacher. When I'm ready for multiplication and division, I go to this teacher. Now we have assessments built that drop them into where they're ready to learn and what they're ready to do on the learning continuum. But we've done away with this idea that they need to be in a second grade classroom. And the other challenge is we've all known it, especially if you're in elementary, we can say we differentiate, which is awesome, and that's great, but there's only so far you can differentiate. There's only a limit. And then we got to ask our question, is that meaningful work, differentiating for the lower level learners and the higher level learners, or are we ready for something completely different? And so by being able to do this, I say that we're differentiating, but we're differentiating on steroids.
What are you looking at?
Thank you, Travis.
I love it. It smells nice.
Is it still going?
Somebody, I think, is unmuted.
Just don't forget it.
Thank you. Travis, great. Thanks so much for that. And I still remember walking into one of your elementary teachers' classrooms, and he took me aside and he said, "This is so great. I can't believe I taught 20 years in the traditional way. I would never go back to teaching that way." And he was absolutely thrilled about the opportunities that were provided by what you're describing. That's a common experience when visiting competency-based schools, to be perfectly honest. If we have a minute or two at the end, we might be able to respond to another question. Before we do that, I just want to share some of the many resources that are available to support your transformation to competency-based education. And I want to mention the Aurora Institute website, which has publications on a wide range of policy and practice issues. Some of our most recent ones are shown here, including reports on equity, quality, professional development, state and federal policy, and one that just came out today, actually, in the top right from Vermont, which is all about a series of professional convenings that they've conducted to improve local comprehensive assessment systems within competency-based education. So hot off the press. We also have 2 blogs that are very active and that share trends and analysis and lessons learned in practice and policy. You can, of course, visit them on our website or subscribe to our newsletters to get updates about our new blog posts and other resources. These images are from our Competency Works blog, and the one on the left is from the Aurora Institute's annual strategic reflection, where it shows new publications from many other organizations who are also doing fantastic work in advancing competency-based education. So we hope you'll also look at those. And if you ever have questions about other organizations that are that are doing work to support your transition to competency-based education, feel free to contact me. And you can see just from these reports and books that there's just a real wealth of resources out there. The image on the right is from one of our most popular blog posts, which brings together about 200 of our blog posts from our visits to schools all over the country, organized by state. So it can help you find competency-based schools in your state or nearby that you can visit or offer as examples to local stakeholders. And there are links to all of those resources I was just mentioning in the chat now. Thanks for that, Alexis. And I see that we are just 1 minute from our end. So I'm going to skip this slide and move on to our closing. If you have some, well, first of all, I just wanted to say we have a survey, which we would really appreciate you filling out. It's just 3 questions. And I think Alexis is about to paste it into the chat. And while you're doing that, just wanted to say, we hope this session has been helpful. And the Aurora Institute and Alexis and I, we'd really deeply like to thank Althea, Rosemary, and Travis for joining us to share their knowledge and experience from leading competency-based or mastery-based work in New York and South Dakota. We appreciate everyone joining us today and for all of your excellent questions and comments in the chat box. I see that the link to the follow-up survey is in the chat if you want to click on that before we go. And thanks everyone again. We wish you all good health and the same to your families and communities. And thanks again to our presenters today. It was really great. Take care, everyone.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you so
Eliot.
much.